All right, so we will get started here this evening. Thanks everyone for keeping muted while we get rolling and while our speaker presents tonight, and for turning on your camera if you're able. So I just wanted to, for those of you who maybe weren't able to attend the last meeting, just wanted to make everyone aware of some business that happened last time. Well, not really business, but an amazing thing is that the Foster Parent Association received over $6,000 donation that John worked hard to figure out where some dollars had went from a former statewide organization for foster and adoptive parents, and they made some significant donations across the state to worthy organizations, and chose to give Region 7 over $6,000. So, if you see John, thank him for his efforts around that and for that amazing donation. So tonight we have a great training lined up. So Heather is with us from Nexus Path, and I am pretty sure that I've heard she could talk like for hours on this topic, but tonight she's going to give us around 90 minutes of trauma-related training, and she will take questions at the end of her presentation, so feel free to chat in questions along the way if you have any. But she's been providing training like this for a while, so this isn't her first rodeo. She's got some good content for us tonight, so tune in. And Heather, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Leslie. This is just such an honor. It's one of my favorite things to do is to spend time with foster parents. So thank you for allowing me the privilege to spend some time with you this evening. I know how precious and valuable every last minute you all can squeeze into a day is. And so thank you for your time and attention. And the invitation to be here too. I think is Amber that first reached out to me. So I think what I will do is, if you guys are all comfortable with it, I would be open to just taking questions or comments as we go through tonight, and at times might even pause and ask for your examples or for you to participate if you don't mind. It just helps us stay, a bit more connected instead of me just reciting a bunch of information to you. So I guess a couple things about me. I've been at Nexus Path for about 5 years. I spent, prior to my time coming here to Path, I was at the Neuropsychiatric Research Institute in Fargo. Sounds way fancier than it really is. It's quite the mouthful. But what I did there was, I'm a clinician by training, a mental health therapist by training, and spent my time there when I first graduated from school in eating disorders, primarily with adults, and then after recognizing through all of that work with men and women with eating disorders, from anything from bulimia to anorexia to candidates for bariatric or gastric bypass surgery, as you might know it as, just really started to recognize the overlap between childhood trauma and adversity in childhood and adult eating disorders. And I couldn't help but think to myself, like, man, what if we could have actually got to some of these individuals that I was spending my time treating as adults when they were children, and how maybe we could have changed the trajectory for some of these folks. And so around 2005, we really started doing some more strategic work and focus around building the mental health system in North Dakota to be more equipped to deal with children and families who had experienced traumatic life events. And so we began training other clinicians in a treatment model called trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, which some of you may have encountered in your time fostering, and grew a clinical network of about 300 mental health clinicians who had had training and to provide this intervention. And while that's really important work, and it felt rewarding to grow our clinical expertise in the state of North Dakota around this issue, for me, it was also just a light bulb moment about where I was really meant to be. And that was in the space that was more around other child and family serving systems to really educate and bring awareness of how trauma impacts children, how it shows up in their behavior, and how we can more effectively identify it and get proper treatment when it's needed. Early 2010 or 12, UND Training Center had contracted me to start working with treatment level foster care providers, which at the time were PATH treatment foster parents. And so I always say that the reason I ended up at PATH in 2015 was really largely because I fell in love with their foster parents. So people just like yourselves who give so so much to the system and often are going very unrecognized for your commitment and hard work every day, 24/7 with kids and families in North Dakota. So again, just it's always been a privilege for me to get to spend time with all of you because I have so much respect for the work that you're doing. I live actually on the Minnesota side of the river. I have to make that disclaimer with my husband and 3 boys. And so I always say my family life and play leisure time is on the Minnesota side of the river, but my entire career has been spent working in North Dakota systems. So currently I work as an operations director here and still get the joy of training foster parents and staff as part of my job as well. So I'm going to share a slide set tonight and we're just going to kind of walk through this training. Some of you, I know you have kids around and I'll just leave it up to you as to kind of your comfort level with some of the material, and I'll do my best to be a little bit sensitive about that, but some of it may strike people as difficult to hear at times. So just a heads up about that. So I'm going to just try to share my slides here and see if we can. So I spend a lot of my time not just training foster parents in our child welfare system in North Dakota and some of our child welfare professionals, but I train juvenile court, legal aid attorneys, different systems, and do a lot of training with our public education system. And this is a slide set that I was asked when I was asked to speak to the Fargo Police Department. So I'm going to use this as a guideline and tailor it to our conversation, just because as was mentioned, most of the training I do with foster parents is actually about 12 to 15 hours on this topic. And so I had to find a real condensed slide set to just give you a flavor for it. And then we can discuss whether or not you want me to come back for more. But this will be a real brief introduction to the topic if you haven't already had some experience with it. What I would also say is I just really want to recognize that there's likely expertise in the room here. Some of you may have had previous trauma-informed care training, and some of you might just be getting this topic for the first time. Just honoring that I recognize we often have both. And so encourage those of you that have a lot of experience to share openly with that. And I will try my best to kind of meet in the middle, acknowledging some of you might have some exposure and some of you are new to the topic. But that's always the biggest challenge for me as a trainer when you have such a spectrum of experience and knowledge on the topic. Regardless, you're all licensed foster parents. So the one thing I do know you come to tonight's session with is a ton of examples of how trauma shows up in the children that you are serving each and every day. So that I know we can have a lot of rich discussion around. Okay, let's see if I can get my slides to go into slide. Oh no, they don't want to do that. Okay. We're going to try this one more time. Okay, that's better. And then just know that I can't see all of you, so I only, see a few of you, but please take yourself off mute and don't hesitate to interrupt me, or maybe Leslie or Amber, you guys can kind of watch the chat. If people have questions, feel free to type in there, and then Amber or Leslie, you guys can interrupt me too, whatever works best. I just don't want people to feel like they can't bring up a question as we go. Any questions or concerns as we get started? Okay, here we go. All right, so we're going to talk tonight just a little bit about like, what do we mean when we're talking about trauma? A lot of times the folks in this type of setting immediately think we're just talking about child abuse and neglect. So one of the things I clarified tonight is that that's not what this conversation is about. Certainly it includes those things, but it includes many other experiences as well. I don't think we're going to get time for a case study tonight, but we will talk a little bit about the adverse childhood experiences study and a little bit, don't get too intimidated here, but a little bit about the science or the neurobiology around childhood trauma. And then we'll talk some about resilience and some strategies for you all to consider. So I'm going to kind of rapid fire walk through these. Again, interrupt me as you'd like. But I want to make sure we have some time at the end to talk about strategies as well. So when I'm talking about traumatic events or childhood trauma, I'm not just talking about child abuse or neglect type experiences. I'm talking about any event that threatens the life or physical integrity of a child or somebody that they care deeply about. So that could be a best friend, a parent, of course, a sibling, a grandparent, and could also include a pet. When I was doing a lot of therapy, certainly some of the most traumatic experiences that some of the children that I worked with had encountered was parents killing their pets in front of them or beating their pets in front of them as a way to threaten the child. And so those, a pet could be certainly considered a traumatic experience if there was harm done to it. And then importantly, traumatic events are almost always accompanied by a physiological response. So that's our fight, flight, or freeze response. And that's what makes a traumatic event different than everyday stress. So sometimes people challenge me and say, really, Heather? Like everybody experiences trauma at some level. And while trauma is common, there is about a third of humans that actually don't encounter trauma in childhood. And I think it should be something that we strive to avoid versus something that we normalize. And so while it is common, what makes it very different in terms of everyday stress is that activation of fight, flight, or freeze. And we'll talk a lot about that physiological response to stress that all humans encounter when faced with a life-threatening event, because that is the key to how it impacts our kids and how it shows up in their behavior. And it tells us a lot about what our responses need to be if we're going to really help children overcome those early experiences around trauma. So traumatic stress for me refers to the physical and emotional responses of the child to those threatening situations. So when these life, or I call them scary life experiences, to happen to children when they're too young, it overwhelms their ability to cope, and problematic reactions begin to interfere with their normal development. And now, while most children are extremely resilient, we also want to note that we work in a system, right, that by nature in child welfare is serving a sample of children, a population of children that has more experience around trauma than the average child. If you were looking at a normal set of a population of children, we would say that when children encounter traumatic events, most are resilient, and maybe a third of children actually need targeted traumatic treatment or trauma treatments. That with supportive caregivers, healthy communities, and supportive trauma-sensitive schools and teachers, that most children really do well in the aftermath of trauma. But it's about a third of those kids that need trauma-specific mental health interventions. When we're looking at the child welfare sample, so for those kids in foster care, that raises to 60 to 70% pretty easily in terms of the number of kids that need targeted interventions that address trauma that's generally driving a lot of the behaviors that you're seeing. So I think about three types of trauma: acute, chronic, and complex. So just very briefly, acute trauma is that one-time car accident. It's a child that experiences being attacked by a dog, the isolated date rape, or being in a natural disaster like a tornado or a flood. So here's where you can start to see that childhood trauma doesn't just include maltreatment, but also other forms of traumatic events like natural disasters, or having a parent or sibling die by suicide, or having a parent with a chronic illness. So acute traumatic events are isolated in time and they happen once. What we know about acute trauma is that children that experience acute trauma are by far the most likely to be resilient in the aftermath of those experiences. They're the least likely to have negative outcomes, largely because of two reasons. We think when children experience acute trauma, generally there's a supportive caregiver involved and safety is generally restored relatively quickly. We know that those are two predictors of what help kids overcome traumatic experiences. Then we move to chronic trauma. So that's the experience of multiple traumatic events over a long period of time. So an example, of course, would be like repeated physical abuse, or for the child that experiences domestic violence at home, maybe shows up to school where there's violence, or has a parent die from a chronic illness. So multiple traumatic events. The problem here is that this increases the risk for negative outcomes because each of those scary life experiences reinforces the negative outcomes from the first time. So for that 4-year-old that witnesses domestic violence, starts to think adults are not safe, or I can't trust men, or whatever it might be, then when they go to school and something scary happens there, it just kind of confirms like, oh, the world is a scary place, you can't trust adults, etc. And so it's chronic and it compounds one event after another. Now, complex trauma is a type of chronic trauma, but it's different in that to be complex trauma, it begins early in childhood, often in infancy or toddlerhood. And those traumatic experiences are perpetrated by the individuals responsible for protecting that child. So it is within the last 10 to 15 years that the field has really started to tease out complex trauma as the highest risk for negative outcomes. And so we really want to be aware of a child's trauma history, whether or not it's chronic or complex, because we need to be very closely monitoring and assessing the needs for targeted treatment so that we can avoid that trajectory that is a lot of negative outcomes that we're going to talk about tonight to some degree. So you can see why when you have complex trauma, you remove the number one predictor of resilience in children, and that's right, a supportive caregiver. So we know that increases the risk for negative outcomes. Just feel like I need to mention also historical trauma, recognizing the role that this plays in many of the kids that we're serving in foster care in North Dakota. We know we serve a disproportionate number of Native American children in foster care in North Dakota in general, compared to our population. And so it's just important to recognize the real roots here and the science that's really validated the impact of historical trauma, whether that's from centuries of slavery, being removed from your homelands, like some of our new American populations, massacres, genocides, that culture or racial oppression, forced placement in boarding schools, like many of our Native American families have experienced, and just that general erosion of cultural practices. So this is, of course, not just that historical perspective, but the problem with historical trauma is that it's repeated in microaggressions that continue to happen through discrimination and all of these types of things that families continue to experience day in and day out. So recognizing the mass impact that this experience has on an entire group of people. Certainly other sources of stress compound or increase the risk for negative outcomes: poverty, discrimination, separations from parents and siblings, frequent moves and school problems, parental substance abuse, and parents that are incarcerated. So while we don't necessarily always describe each of these individually as traumatic life events, certainly we think of them as secondary traumas that compound the impact of those life-threatening events. I've had people really push me on at times like poverty in itself being a trauma, and we can't go there because there are many individuals, many children who grow up with extreme poverty that never experience trauma because they grow up with supportive caregivers, their needs are met at a very basic level. And so it can be really dangerous to associate just poverty in general with childhood trauma. Certainly there's increased risk there, but poverty alone isn't something we would consider a trauma. We know the impact of early adversity and trauma on children is certainly impacting their ability to perform well in school, lower GPA, higher rates of school absences, higher likelihood of dropout, suspensions, expulsions, decreased IQ and reading ability, deficits in areas that are really important for learning, and then just more often likely to be referred to special education services. And I would say this is because our schools have never addressed a different way of dealing with kids with childhood trauma, not because they're bad, but because we really didn't talk about this until more recent years. And so schools are starting to do a lot more work around how they can address childhood trauma in a way that doesn't mean you just refer the kid for special education services. And I'm going to come back, I'll circle around to that point in just a minute. The bottom line here is that there is clearly a call for our educators to listen to this conversation equally as much as our foster care providers or our primary care docs or our child protection workers. So how does trauma impact kids? The first thing I'm going to talk about is just kind of classic PTSD. So probably when I say that, many of you think of, post-traumatic stress disorder, and you think of that term largely associated with our military. And there's a good reason that that's the first, kind of word that kind of comes to people's mind when you think about PTSD. And that's because it really wasn't until the early 80s that we started to talk about post-traumatic stress disorder as we began recognizing how war trauma was showing up in our Vietnam vets. And this was the first time that term was coined, was the early 80s. And the first time it began to be diagnosed, largely in adults that had served in Vietnam, is where it started. We talk about three main symptom sets that kind of characterize post-traumatic stress disorder. And I call these kind of classic PTSD. And the reason I say that is because this is how trauma shows up in adults, largely, okay? You have hyperarousal, which means you get, somebody who's nervous, jumpy, quick to react to threats. That example of, hearing the car backfire and instantly the veteran is re-experiencing those war experiences or combat experiences. Then you have re-experiencing symptoms, again, similar here, where you get intrusive images, sensations, or dreams. You have traumatic memories that really intrude in daily functioning from those scary life experiences or traumatic life experiences. And then lastly, the group of symptoms that you notice in adults with PTSD is avoidance. And this is actually the most common symptom in adults with PTSD of any sort, is that they start to feel numb and shut down, separate from normal life, really start to pull away from activities and relationships, and avoid things that prompt memories, of the trauma, which is why Afghanistan and Iraq and Vietnam are not common dinner topics. Adults really figure out that one of the most successful ways to manage that trauma is to avoid talking about it. And it makes sense. It's why suicide and substance abuse are so high in our military. Those are extreme forms of avoidance. And the bottom line is they work. They're effective in mitigating kind of the negative effects of trauma, because when you can avoid thinking about those memories, you avoid the big feelings from coming up. So avoidance is a really good strategy. Numbing it all out works. The problem is, right, you don't get to selectively numb out the good and the bad. You numb out all of it. You don't get to say, I'm not going to talk about Vietnam. I'm not going to talk about my experiences there, and get to go to the basketball game and thoroughly enjoy it, or be intimate with your partner and feel enjoyment. You numb out everything when you start to use that as a coping strategy, and that's why it becomes problematic. So while that's the most common symptom in adults, what we see in children is the most common symptom set, I bet all of you could guess, is not avoidance, but rather a different colored box, the green one. Nervous, jumpy, quick to startle, can't focus, can't pay attention, hypervigilant, looking out for danger, can't sustain attention. And I would imagine many of you also know that that's highly overlapping with another very common childhood disorder that's largely overdiagnosed in our foster care children in North Dakota. And that's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADD. And so we have a real challenge on our hands when we're working with kids in foster care to disentangle, is this PTSD or is this ADHD? And that is hard for our most sophisticated clinicians to tease out. So we know that many children who are suffering from the effects of childhood trauma are not diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. Why? Because their symptoms don't look this clean. They may have some of them, but usually children have a lot more symptoms that don't nicely always fall into these categories. And so we get a lot of kids with a whole bunch of other labels I'm sure many of you are familiar with: attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, bipolar disorder, reactive attachment disorder. The list goes on and on. The average child that I know is placed in a PATH foster home has 4 mental health diagnoses. And the average age kid that we serve is, sometimes around 12 or 13. And so, I do not believe for 1 minute that these children have 4 and 5 and 6 psychiatric disorders at age 8, 10, 12, or 14. And the problem with our system, it's not that we mean ill, but we have a system that's based on labels, right? So in order for a kid to even come to, like, for example, a PATH foster home, right, a higher level of care, they need a mental health diagnosis. For a kid or for a clinician like myself, if I was doing clinical work, to get paid by an insurance company, I have to label them with something. In order to get them special education services, we have to label them with something. And so what happens is when kids experience childhood trauma and our systems don't understand it, we get a whole bunch of labels that never get to the root of the actual problem. That largely what's driving a lot of the issues for many of the children in foster care has to do with their traumatic experiences, not a bona fide psychiatric disorder. Now, while there are kids in foster care that certainly have real ADHD or a mood disorder or an anxiety disorder, I would be willing to bet that many of them are also mislabeled. So it becomes really tricky to make sure you're getting an accurate trauma-informed assessment that in terms of the labels that are put on a kid. So for me, when this label is like, hi, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, how about you take Charlie, age 10, ADHD, ODD, conduct disorder, bipolar, and reactive attachment disorder. If I'm that family, I'm terrified. Like, what the heck does that mean? Where I challenge you, when you see all those labels, if you do even get that information when a child is placed in your home, to really say, I wonder if this is how trauma is showing up in this child. That instead of ADHD, let's start with the idea that maybe when you live most of your life terrified, it's really hard to pay attention. It's really hard not to constantly be looking for danger when that's how your brain was wired. They have oppositional defiant disorder. They have a hard time taking directions from authority figures. I wonder if I might also, if adults had violated my trust my entire childhood. Conduct disorder, similar kinds of thinking. Bipolar disorder. Oh, I wonder if the mood dysregulation is because children who are traumatized have a hard time containing all the big feelings that they have to manage, and they don't have the skills to do it. I wonder if reactive attachment disorder is likely because it's hard to attach to people when you've never had consistency in how they care for and protect you and keep you safe, instead of a big, bad, scary psychiatric disorder. And I'm not saying, I'm a clinician, so I'm not saying there's not legitimacy to all of these disorders, but we know that children in foster care end up with way more of these labels because we're trying to get them help. It's a system desperate to try to get them help. And in the meantime, the bottom bullet point, all of these diagnoses combined do not capture how trauma is impacting them, and it leads to ineffective treatment plan. It leads to medications that don't treat the root of the problem. Sure, could ADHD medicine help? Maybe, but it might help many of us too. We might eat less, be focused more, all sorts of things when you take a stimulant, but it also can make kids worse. And so we really do have to assess carefully what's driving the behavior. And is it a true psychiatric disorder, or is it indeed a lifetime of adversity and trauma that's really impacting this child's ability to function? And the science is crystal clear that childhood trauma impacts a kid's ability to function. And we're going to talk about what exactly that is and how kids get there. So when we see trauma or PTSD in kids, and probably most of the kids that come into your home, you see it see it show up in a ton of different ways. And I know you guys, if we had more time, could rattle off a gazillion different behaviors you see, from not being able to control their emotions, being impulsive, food hoarding, suicidal ideation, cutting, poor hygiene, self-esteem, relationships, somatic complaints or biological complaints, meaning frequent headaches, stomach aches, cognitive problems, more developmental delays, all of these things. And there's not an easy list, right? You don't get to give the people that are trying to understand what you do, here's the list of what to look for, because then you'll know it's childhood trauma. I can't give you a list because trauma looks different in every kid. And if there's anything you walk away from tonight, it has to be that message. This looks different in every single kid. Some kids, it can show up like I treated the valedictorian of a high school class that's anorexic and suffered some of the most profound child abuse I've ever experienced, and everybody thought she was perfect. To the kid that we can't get through first grade. It's the kid who eats too much, the kid who doesn't eat at all. It's the kid who runs all the time. It's the kid who's not active at all. It's the kid that's angry and aggressive and pissed off at the world. And it's the person sitting in the back of the classroom with their hoodie over their head, silently suffering and would never tell anybody. It's the kid that withdraws and doesn't want to talk. And it's the kid that talks about their trauma and their stuff all the time. It shows up, it's the kid that's arrogant and narcissistic and trying to be somebody that they're not. And it's the kid that has no self-esteem, that can't show up or have friends or, make friendships with anybody. So it's really difficult to sift out. And that's why it requires each and every one of you, every time you're working with a kid, is putting on these lenses of trauma-informed care, looking at the behaviors that you're seeing in the kids that you're serving, and asking yourself this question: what might the role of trauma be here? And we have an obligation to ask that question, because for so many years, you guys, it's not been asked. We didn't ask the question, we just put on the label. We pointed out, here's what's wrong with this kid, instead of here's what's happened to this kid. And that's how you get 8-year-olds with 4 psychiatric diagnoses. When you look for what's wrong with the kid instead of what's happened to the kid. So ask those questions to yourself. And on your hardest days, right, when you're about ready to pull all your hair out, I do think it gives you just a nudge, like a hair bit more of patience and understanding. Their behavior is not about you. It is not about you. You see the tip of the iceberg. What's underneath all of that is everything that they brought into your home. And the minute you start to think it's about you, it's personal, and it's going to really impact your ability to be an effective foster parent. So the other thing you have to remember is this is not personal. This is about everything that they've got packed deep inside of them from their earliest life experiences. And for some of the kids you're serving, they're 3 years old and they only got 3 years of that experience. And some of them have 17 years of that experience packed underneath there. That's what we have to remember as we approach their behavior and do our best to support them day in and day out, and help advocate every day with all the systems that they're touching as well. So just briefly, I spent 14 years in research doing clinical work, as I said before, in eating disorders, but then also in childhood trauma. And so I just have such a deep respect for science. And I feel like we owe it to the kids that we serve in the child welfare system to make sure that we are providing them with the best available treatments and that we're making decisions based on science. And I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about this. So I apologize for some of you who might just gloss over when I talk about science, but I'm sure many of you have heard of the adverse childhood experiences experience study, but I want to just summarize it in about 10 minutes here. So this was a study that was done and sadly first published in 1998. Vince Folletti on the left here was an internist at Kaiser Permanente, one of the most progressive HMOs down in San Diego, California, working interestingly related to my background in adult obesity clinics. And he started to realize this pattern of, not of the number of adults with obesity that also had histories of childhood trauma. And he became curious and said, what is the chance that childhood trauma and adversity actually impacts adult health, including things like obesity? Not that it's the only pathway to obesity, but what if it actually just increases the risk? So he teamed up with Robert Anda, who at the time was this hot to trot researcher down at the Center for Disease Control, CDC, in Atlanta, Georgia. And they studied about 18,000 adults that belonged to the Kaiser Permanente healthcare plan. So they could ask these adults about their childhood experiences and then look into their medical records. So this is about 18,000 adults who it's a biased sample, to be real honest. 70% college educated, 70% Caucasian, and privileged enough to have some of the best health insurance in the world. They asked them these 10 questions. How many of these experiences did you have before the age of 18? And I'd ask that all of you in your head silently kind of count up your ACE score yourself. So you calculate your ACE score or your adverse childhood experience score by asking yourself, which of these experiences did I encounter before age 18? For every one that you experienced, you give yourself a 1. So it's a sheer count. The first 5 are classic child maltreatment experiences. And of course, in the original study, by the way, you guys, these were phrased out so people knew what did they mean by physical, and sexual abuse. They were defined. But so basically, were you physically abused, sexually abused, emotionally neglected, or physically neglected before the age of 18? Or did you live? And then the next group of questions is more around adversity, or what the researchers termed household dysfunction. And they were kind of throwing darts at a board, like what impacts humans that causes negative health problems. They said, well, we think living with an adult that's mentally ill, depressed, or suicidal impacts that. Living with somebody who's drug addicted or alcoholic, witnessing domestic violence, losing a parent to death or abandonment, including abandonment by divorce. So not were your parents divorced, but did you lose a relationship with one of your parents entirely as a result of the divorce? Then you give yourself a 1. And then lastly, did you have an incarcerated family member? Total up your ACE score, that's your ACE score. Total up the number of these, that's your ACE score. So for example, we collect this data on every kid we serve at Path. The average kid that comes to Nexus Path for treatment foster care has experienced 6 of these by the time they're placed in one of our homes. So keep that in mind as we look at what the study showed. Not only did we learn that childhood trauma was common, in that 2/3 of the sample had experienced at least 1 ACE, so had a score of at least 1. But we also learned, and what was most powerful is this dose-response relationship. So the higher your ACE score, the higher your risk of all of the things here on the left. So the higher your ACE score, the more risk you have for alcoholism, COPD, depression, high-risk sexual behavior. I mean, you guys can read liver disease, obesity, asthma, cancer, smoking, tons of negative outcomes. I could go on and on about leads to unemployment, all sorts of social factors as well. The moral of the story here, the takeaway was the higher dose of adversity and trauma that you have in childhood, the higher risk of all of these things, including suicide, 12 times more likely to die by suicide. We talk a ton about suicide prevention in the state of North Dakota. If you have an ACE score of 0, your risk of dying by suicide before the age of 18 is less than 2%. And not dying by suicide, having a suicide attempt by the age of 18 is less than 2%. If your ACE score is 4 or more, so I had you guys calculate your own ACE scores, but maybe some of you are calculating the ACE scores of kids that are currently placed in your home as well. If your ACE score is 4 or more, your risk of attempting suicide is 1 out of 5, about 20%. So you can't look at data, and you guys, it wouldn't matter what the label was at the top of this. This is what you see. This is a dose response relationship. This is what you see no matter if you put age of first cigarette smoking, marijuana use, unemployment, disability, asthma, cancer, you name it, same stepwise progression. And the real turning point seems to be an ACE score of 4 or more. If you have an ACE score of 6 or more, it actually takes 20 years off your life expectancy, and your relatives will die earlier as well. Okay, so we have data now that says, oh my goodness, you can do all of this damage to children when you expose them to traumatic events, all of these negative health outcomes, and it can take 20 years off your life, which, by the way, when we first published studies on cigarette smoking, it said it took 8 years off your life. And we all went crazy in public health. Stop the cigarette smoking, right? Takes 8 years. Oh, subsequent studies showed 10 years. Now we have data that says childhood trauma takes 20 years off your dang life, and we can hardly get the conversation started about how we need to address childhood trauma. We can't just keep putting Band-Aids on things like suicide prevention. Do we need to put money into opioid addiction, suicide, and all, binge drinking, alcohol? Sure. But if we only spend our dollars there and we don't go further up the river and address what drives all of that, which is childhood trauma, we will never bend the curve. Your ACE score, if you have an ACE score of 4 or more, the ACE score predicts 7 of the 10 leading causes of death in the United States of America. If we want to change how much we spend on healthcare, let's start investing money in supporting families and early intervention, and we can avoid that trajectory. So this is what I spend my life trying to tell people about, is how do we continue to make sure people understand this science is clear. We have to go up the river, and we can't keep labeling things that are trauma driven as ADHD or bipolar. Or, you guys, I might have a heart attack. It gets me so frustrated to see RAD and like our whole system just sign off to those things because we don't get those kids the right treatment. So when you are working with mental health professionals like me, when I was doing that, ask good questions. What's your training around trauma? What are we doing to address the traumatic stress here? It doesn't mean, you don't want to disrupt clinical relationships with children if you don't have to, but you got to ask the questions if you're not hearing your clinicians that are working with your kids talking about this. Kids in foster care, there is no way when you're addressing their mental health, you aren't having to take into account trauma exposure. And if they're not talking about it, that's a red flag. So you should be asking good questions. I always say that's the best way you can advocate for your kids, whether it's in the mental health system or at schools, you guys, is ask pointed questions and then drop the mic. Otherwise, right, we run the risk of you being the crazy foster parent, and then they discount what you say. And your voice is so critically important when you are supporting these kids 24/7. You have to be in the loop. You have to know what's going on. You have to understand what their meds are for. And so your voice matters. So I guess if there's anything I'm saying is just empowering you to ask really good questions. We can't be the experts, but make the team answer the questions. Okay, so ACE study. So people start to say, all right, really? So you do bad things to kids when they're little and you get sick adults. Like, how the heck does that really happen? Well, here's what I can tell you. In the first published study in 1998, remember when I said it was published? This is over 20 damn years ago, and we're still talking about how to address childhood trauma. Just now, really, as a whole country, starting to talk about this. The first published study did not have an orange bar. It said the authors theorized that you do bad stuff to kids in childhood, you get social, emotional, and cognitive problems that leads to somebody to adopt high-risk health behaviors like smoking, sexual promiscuity, drug use, eating disorders, whatever, that leads to disease, disability, and social problems, and ultimately early death. Okay. Then, thank goodness, our scientists came along and we got better access to PET scans, MRI scans, all of the neuroscience, where the neuroscientists would say, hey, social scientists, you can't just say bad stuff happens and you get early death. Like, how does it happen, right? Well, then there's so much science that has come forward that says we know exactly how it happens. You disrupt childhood brain development. When you live as a child in a stage or a state of fight, flight, or freeze, most of your developing childhood, you get disrupted brain development. And that's how you get all the impairments. That's how you get all the behaviors. Not because it's a choice, but because you have created an entirely different environment to grow a brain than a child that grows a brain with safe, supportive, predictive, nurturing arms wrapped around it, so to speak. So we know that the way you grow a brain is entirely based on relationships with caregivers. Babies are born with like 2 to 3 billion brain cells, which is super and awesome, and none of them are connected until they start to interact with their environment. So that brain development starts the minute they come out of that womb and they're interacting with their caregiver, which is why people say sing to your kids, hold your kids, right? Feed your kids on a routine schedule, all of these things, because that's how you're making those neurons connect. And that's, in essence, brain development in its most simplified form. The more that those experiences are repeated, the stronger those connections become. Read to your kids, sing to your kids, talk around your kids, even before they can talk. Because the more you repeat experiences, the stronger the connections become. Here's an example, just a quick slide where you can see none of those neurons are formed in a newborn. And as that child develops, particularly 0 to 3 or 0 to 5, the density of those neurons and those synapses becomes much more dense by 2 years. And then you can see the comparison to adulthood. And what I want you to note is that actually the adult slide is less dense, but what's thicker? The wiring is thicker because of the repeated experience. And here's what happens, you guys. Around middle school or adolescence, I sometimes joke at my house that this explains my teenagers' behavior, is their brain is pruning itself. It's getting rid of all of that busy wiring that's not being utilized, that is not being routinely utilized. So just like a plant, the brain is pruning itself and only keeping the most efficient wiring. Okay, so take 30 seconds and reflect on what that means for a kid that grows up in an environment of constant chaos and fear. What kind of experiences are happening day in and day out, either for too long a period of time or too often? And what kind of brain are we wiring? It's not hard to imagine, right? We shouldn't have needed neuroscience to make this case. You guys could have told people bad stuff happens when you abuse and neglect children. It's not hard to figure out. You put a kid in toxic stress and chaos and harm, you get a brain that looks really different from one that's raised in a really nurturing environment. So the interesting thing here is there's both risk and opportunity. The brain is especially malleable or plastic or adjustable, for lack of a better word. The risk, of course, is that kids in a toxic environment, you get a brain that's not wired effectively to survive in the everyday world. If you take the brain out of the toxic environment and put it in a home like yours, you can start to rewire that brain. The brain is malleable and flexible, and you can impact that. And if I didn't believe that to the depths of my soul, I would not spend my entire life telling people like you that we can change brains, because you have to know you can change brains. If we had MRI scanners that we could afford to put every kid in before they go into your home, and when they leave, I guarantee you would see that their brains change. And the science is clear. We have vets from Afghanistan that can go take 12 sessions of cognitive behavioral therapy, talk therapy, pre and post MRIs show changes in brain structure and functioning. If we can change adult brains, you are changing children's brains.
Heather.
There's absolutely no doubt.
This
Sorry,
is Amber. Yep. So actually, like, I've came up with questions and literally your next slide is answering it. So you're not even giving me an opportunity to ask you questions, but I have gotten feedback on my phone that you are a rock star and everybody loves you and you are absolutely amazing. But so, and this is kind of a personal thing, but we adopted, she's now 3, but we got her right from the NICU. She was only 27 weeks. So yes, her environment that she has been with now, hopefully we have changed her brain, but has there been any studies done that is like in utero and how much damage was done? Because she had meth and cocaine and everything yucky. So
yeah. Great question. And that's a really tricky one. First of all, because it is hard to tease out what's related to childhood, what's related to trauma. What I would say is, like, I've heard Dr. Anda, the developer or the scientist behind the ACE study, talk about this, and they really believe that some of the problems that we see in children begin in utero through the cortisol that's going through the mom's body. If she's like in a domestic violence relationship or something like that, that is impacting them. So they're almost born essentially with an ACE score because of the mom's trauma and how those stress hormones circulate through that fetus while it's in utero. So I do think we're learning more about that. The science is developing every day, but I think there's a strong belief that we absolutely have evidence that in utero stress and trauma impacts childhood development. Now, what we know is the earlier children experience trauma and the longer it lasts, the more negative the outcomes. So this is contrary to what many people in my field thought for many, many years. The theory was, don't talk about it. Oh my God, if they were removed when they were 3 or 2 or 6, for God's sake, don't bring it up because you're going to re-traumatize them. The opposite couldn't be more true. Those traumatic experiences live within that child. And if we try to suppress and push, it just comes out sideways. It's going to come out in a different direction. And so we know that the best way to address trauma is through creating space for them to talk about it, whether that's in trauma-focused therapy or just creating safe emotional environments like you all do in your homes for kids to talk about their feelings and their experiences. For many kids, that's enough to heal. But the other thing that complicates your question is the impact of substance abuse in utero, which is different than trauma that can, again, cause lasting neurological impacts that aren't necessarily related to trauma per se, but actual substance exposure. So it is really hard to tease out, but here's what I can tell you. The hope lies in how early you got to wrap your loving arms around them and, believe wholeheartedly that with your support, this child, it was 1 child or 2, 1, it's going to be resilient. And, I have a lot of women that come up to me and they're like not even asking about their own foster care kids. They're asking about their own child that was born at 2 pounds and spent its first days in the NICU and how traumatic that is. And I think we're just starting to learn more about that. So it's a good question and one that we don't fully have the answer to, but we suspect can certainly impact kids down the road. Again, the beauty there is the resilience of the brain and how much it can overcome. So this slide really just summarizes that what happens when kids grow up in these environments where they're constantly exposed to really life-threatening situations, that fight, flight, or freeze system is activated over and over and over again, particularly cortisol. So norepinephrine, adrenaline, cortisol, these are all the stress hormones that circulate through your brain when you encounter something that's scary. When this happens to children over and over and over again, or for just extended periods of time, those stress hormones are poison to the brain. And that's the take-home point, you guys, that really legitimizes how trauma impacts kids negatively in terms of brain development. Stress hormones that are meant to keep us alive, right? When you see a bear in the woods, your brain is supposed to be doused with cortisol. So you make life-threatening or, life-saving quick decisions. But that system, that biology was never created to be experienced day in and day out when you were developing a brain as a child. And that's where it's problematic. That's where the cortisol that keeps us alive when we see a bear in the woods is now the cortisol that damages our brain from mastering the normal developmental tasks that we're supposed to be doing at age 3, 5, 6, or 7. So we see that those neurons don't connect as effectively. So decreased neurogenesis, fancy term for that. Impaired myelination. You guys, if you remember from Basic Science 101, the waxy coating on the neuron that makes the signals transmit really quickly, that's called myelination. That waxy coating is impaired. It doesn't get laid down the same as a child raised in a healthy, safe environment. So these are the ways that we know the science is clear that trauma and scary life experiences negatively impact brain development. Neurons don't form, new neuronal connections don't happen, impaired myelination. By the way, that waxy coating is also what gives your brain size and bulk. We know when you put kids that have been traumatized or maltreated in an MRI machine compared to kids that haven't been, overall smaller brain volumes. So we see structural differences and functioning differences on like a PET scan for kids who have been traumatized early. Then that pruning process I was telling you about, that is also something that we know is inhibited. The brain does not prune itself effectively. And that's another way brain development gets off track when cortisol and stress hormones are overly present in the developing child. Here's one of the earliest examples, you guys. This comes out of like the Romanian orphan literature. So on the left side here, you can see there's a healthy brain. These are 3-year-old brains, by the way. On the left side is the healthy brain. On the right side is a Romanian orphan. So this is an extreme, keep in mind, extreme case of neglect. And what you see is circled there is complete absence of functioning in the temporal lobes for the Romanian orphan. Now, if you don't have temporal lobe functioning, it's incredibly difficult to look like a normal child and function, because this is how your brain takes in sensory information, sight, sound, and whatever, and makes sense of it. But what you'll notice here is the back part of the brain, the most primitive part of the brain here at the bottom, is actually functioning pretty similarly. That's the part that's, responsible for breathing and heart rate, and even starts to go up into the limbic system where you control emotion regulation or like fear response. But the more sophisticated parts of the brain that are required for really adaptive functioning, not working. So this is one of the first studies that really led us to believe that early childhood trauma, and in this case, particularly neglect, extremely devastating for brain development. So what's important for you all to hear me say, because this is the point which sometimes people are like, oh my God, lady, could you deliver a worse message to us on an evening training session? For God's sake, we give our hearts and souls to these children. Maybe they're all damaged and we should just give up. Clearly, I don't believe that. It is never too late. And here's what you have to understand. It's that risk and opportunity piece. It's not going to happen overnight. Unlearning and rebuilding takes time. But you guys, if the science is also coming out, brain development lasts far more into adulthood than we ever imagined. If we can change adult brains through talk therapy, we have studies in OCD and PTSD that demonstrate that. There's no way we can't change and override some of this wiring in the children that have experienced child maltreatment. So here's how I'm going to ask you to think about it. They don't have damaged brains. They have incredibly adaptive brains. So their brains have adapted miraculously and brilliantly to its surroundings. Because when you grow up in an environment where you're constantly exposed to scary things, you better have a brain well-wired to respond to danger, well-wired to be looking for danger and quick to react to threats. That's adaptive in that environment until they put them in your home. And then it looks like a nightmare. Or they send that kid to school and think they're going to sit in a chair and raise their hand. They're spending their entire day looking for the danger. That's what experience they had repeated over and over and over again. not somebody singing lullabies or reading books. And safety trumps the day, always. So your body is always going to look and assess safety before it's going to take on any developmental milestone beyond that. So when you have a child just hyper vigilant, trying to keep itself safe because that's been its genuine life experience, it makes complete sense. It's how our bodies are wired. And until we get that kid in an environment in your homes or at school, or get mom and dad the supports they need, whether it's substance abuse treatment or whatever, we cannot expect that these children will overnight, because they arrived in your safe, cozy home, know how to behave. It will not happen like that. And some adjust and are impacted less than others, and some it takes a long time, but they all show up generally with a real lack of trust for adults, which needs to be our first step if we're going to try to heal. It all happens through relationships. Okay, 7 o'clock. So I just want to talk quickly. Any questions or comments before maybe I transition here?
I have one question, but I also want to say, if you've jumped on after things got started, we don't know you're here unless you tell us your first and last name and the agency you're licensed with. Otherwise, we don't send it into your agency. So some of you need to find the chat box and put your information in there so that we can do that. My question, Heather, is, are there different types of trauma therapy that are better than others, or better for certain situations versus others? And then what about like timeline with therapy, or if you say you don't know that you have those 6 months to get through that trauma therapy, you know, should you press forward regardless? Is it worse to stop in the middle of it? Talk a little bit about that.
Well, that's a loaded question that I could take. Honestly, in my foster parent training, I usually spend about 2 hours on that topic, like how to navigate the mental health system and what to look for, questions to ask therapists, what are red flags. First, I think the first thing I need to say is, people are surprised when I say not every kid that's experienced childhood trauma needs trauma therapy. We would overwhelm and flood our system if we did that. And I think all of you who have ACE scores also know, if you're high functioning and you don't have impaired behavior, would you appreciate somebody telling you you need to go to therapy based on your ACE score? No. So we don't send kids to therapy just because they've experienced trauma. We send kids to therapy because there's problems in how they're able to function at home, at school, childcare, or in other leisure activities. Okay. So once we've established that there's some symptoms or some impairment, then we refer to therapy. Try to make sure you're getting a clinician that's going to at least assess trauma history. In other words, if they don't even ask if the kids had trauma exposure or recognize that they're foster care, you got a problem. And then try to tease out what's driving the behavior. I mean, maybe they have a traumatic brain injury. Maybe it's related to substance abuse in utero. It's not always trauma, but for so many years, we haven't asked the question about trauma. We've just made it be about everything else, including our schools, right? They just refer to special ed. And I guarantee you, if you look for a learning disorder, that's what you're going to get. If you never ask if it's trauma related, you're never going to treat it. I trained at 90 school psychologists in the state of North Dakota about 7 or 8 years ago now, spent 2 days with them. At the end, I said, tell me how many of you have ever, when you've been doing testing for a kid for special ed, asked about childhood trauma? Not one hand went up in the room. We will never identify it early and get the right services if we don't ask the right questions. So when you get to the mental health therapist, if they're not asking questions about trauma, you need to ask the question. And then what I would say is, yes, there are, I think there's a whole list of trauma-focused treatments. The one that's most prevalent in North Dakota is trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, or TFCBT. And I can send you guys lists of this if I send it to Amber or Leslie or whatever, and you guys can distribute it. But there's other ones too, like PCIT, parent-child interaction therapy, child-parent psychotherapy. These are, often really limited in terms of access in our rural areas, maybe more prevalent in Bismarck and Fargo. But the point is you want to make sure that a clinician is trained in some evidence-based practice for treating childhood trauma. That's what we would expect if our kid had cancer. You wouldn't show up to a dermatologist if your kid had cancer. And I don't think you can look at this data and think that it's not life impacting, that you get them the right treatment. So you look for somebody who knows how to treat trauma. As to what that model is, there are several, probably 7 to 8 that I would recommend. Typical course of treatment can really vary, but for a kid in in foster care, typically you're going to see it take longer because there's just, the uncertainty and often multiple placements that disrupt the therapeutic process. And so I would say most therapies, though, should not have to drag on for years. 20 sessions, 4 to 6 months, if it's really targeted. And the other red flag I can't resist but say is if you are not involved in the treatment, major red flag. You cannot treat children. I don't care what kind of thing you're treating as a mental health clinician. If you're doing children's work, if you're treating children and you are not talking or involving the family, ideally in every single session, not going to work. How could I think my 1 hour a week with an 8-year-old is going to have a freaking impact in any direction if I don't have the people who spend 24/7 on board with what we're working on or the teacher? Totally useless. I shouldn't say that. That's really harsh. Maybe there's a slight chance some kids could get it, but 1 hour a week isn't going to do it. And so you have to have the caregivers involved. So if you have clinicians that are not inviting you into session, are letting you go to the grocery store while you drop off your kid for it's like a dental appointment or something, not going to work. And that holds us accountable too, right? I mean, that involves our time and our commitment to help kids heal as well. But we have to involve caregivers. So my first comment would be, I don't think you can be doing good kid work, period, if you're not involving adults. I don't know if that hit on most of your points. Okay.
At what age do you actually let the kid kind of attend therapy himself? Yeah, 2-part question. So again, I wasn't going to bring in like my own stories, but I have a 7-year-old and she went through many, many, many weeks of therapy, and it was hiding under the desks, locking herself in closets, taking her out screaming and hollering. And it's like, okay, when do you stop beating that dead horse? Because it was horrible. So we obviously switched therapists. And then I have another kiddo, a 16-year-old gentleman, and I never go in with his therapy sessions. I talked to his therapist for a little bit, but he's like, no, you're not coming in. So
very good question. And age clearly matters. But quite frankly, if parents don't know what's going on with the 16-year-old, you're also in trouble too. So now there's a difference around confidentiality. And this is something our clinicians here at Path, or when I was doing clinical work, I always addressed with the child I was treating. And that's why I really want to understand why they don't want their caregiver to participate at some level. Because if it's because they think it's embarrassing or, their parent can't take it, which is often what they think, those are things we have to address in therapy. Them carrying around the thoughts that other people can't help them is never going to help them. So we have to address that right away. Now, if the 16-year-old boy doesn't want you involved because he doesn't want you up in his business around behavior that any child would find embarrassing for their parent to know, totally fine. And so we just have to adjust that boundary. But at some level, parents should be involved, ideally, if they're healthy and safe in their child's treatment. So with a teenager, that might look like every other session, a 15-minute touch base. But like if I'm doing trauma-focused CBT, they're going to be in the session for 4 to 5 weeks in a row going through that trauma narrative with us. They don't get to just show up and hear the trauma narrative without being part of the therapy, because I need to assess their ability to support that kid through that. So it does vary, and the foster parent dynamic can also matter in terms of, do I work with a foster parent or do I work with a bio parent? Depends on where we are at with reunification. The other thing is, in terms of trauma-focused CBT, you can do more harm than good if you disrupt therapy in the middle of a trauma narrative. we would never want a custodian moving a kid, and that's why we try to get the whole team on board before we start to do that, because that can be really detrimental to a kid if in the middle of that portion of the therapy. Okay. Quickly, this is just a helpful metaphor. I use this with educators a lot, but foster parents, we can talk about suitcases versus backpacks, but this idea that they show up with this invisible backpack. They don't get to leave all their stuff back at their home. They carry it with you right into your home. We've talked a lot about how trauma impacts their behavior and so forth, but the most powerful way that trauma seems, at least in my experience, it really compels me to do this work, is trauma's impact on the belief of the child about themselves, about others, and about the world in general. So we know it can have great impact on their self-esteem, but also how they look at you as adults and supportive people, caring professionals, teachers, whatever it might be, and then how they view the world in general. So I always share this story just very briefly that illustrates this point, because while it's hard to see kids that are cutting on themselves, super depressed, or severely eating disordered, the hardest part about doing trauma-focused work for me when I was doing clinical work was this third point: how trauma changes their worldview or their beliefs about the world in general. Just briefly, this is a 16-year-old boy that was court referred to me by a juvenile court officer, and he had been in 13 placements. He was 16 years old. At 13 formal placements, and in between those was staying with aunties or uncles or friends or whatever. No consistency in care. And at this point was back home with bio mom. And I was referred to work with this family because he had just assaulted the school resource officer and was about to get kicked out of public school at age 16. And so I was working with him and his mom, visited with his mom for about 30 minutes, as I always do. And then I split my sessions 50-50. Like, I work with the adults equally as much as the kids, not because they're the problem, because they're the solution. And so I bring the kid back after visiting with the mom, and I knew he wasn't going to talk to me. I was probably 25 years old at the time. And I thought, oh my God, this kid's never going to talk to me. He's got his hoodie pulled over his head. His pants are sagging down and he's looking straight at the floor. He sits in my chair and, as predicted, says nothing. And as you can tell in my brief time with you tonight, I'm not really good at silence. So I was doing my best. And finally, I said, in sheer desperation to this young man who still had not made eye contact nor spoke a word, I said, do you see that wand over there on my desk? I work with a lot of little kids, and you'd be surprised when I give them that wand. And it was one of those clear wands that had glitter in it and water that you can flip up and down. I said, I give them that wand and I ask them, man, if you could have 3 wishes, what would you wish for? By the way, you guys file that away. When kids come to your home, ask them that question. Best assessment question in the world. It'll tell you so much about that kid. So I say to this kid out of desperation, like, dude, I got to imagine you wish something could be different. I don't know anything about you, but I just spent 20 to 30 minutes with your mom. And I know that there have to be things that you wish could be different about your world. What would you wish for? Says nothing. I said, come on. I said, I know a lot of 16-year-old boys. By the way, that was total BS. Like, I was the mom of like 3 kids under the age of 5, and I never treated teenagers. I'm like, I know a lot of 16-year-old boys. Like, they'd wish for a car or a phone. Like, what would you wish for? And he finally looked up at me, looked me straight in the face, and I will never forget his big brown eyes. And he looked at me and he said, no, ma'am. Yeah, well, maybe, I guess I'd wish for a lot of money. No, ma'am. No, ma'am. You see, if I wish for a lot of money, everybody would know my dad stole it from the bank. No, ma'am, I wouldn't wish for anything. And he put his head down and he never looked up at me again. And that kid, if I could only imagine where he is today, because there's no success story that follows here. If he only knew that every time I train, I tell his story, because he taught me 3 really important lessons really early in my career. The first thing he taught me was no hope. If I'm a 16-year-old kid that can't even imagine my life could be different without something terribly bad going wrong, what kind of hope do I have for the future? And why would I give a crap about graduating from high school? See, nothing good could come his way. He had never had an experience that reinforced the idea that when you work hard or you do something, good things can actually happen. His life had been everything but that. And it was wired well. And it was really adaptive because it helped him survive from one day to the next in an incredibly dysfunctional world. So again, no hope. If we as professionals can't help restore that hope, I believe we will never be able to change the trajectory of those kids, because they don't just show up thinking good stuff is going to happen if they work hard or if they listen to you. Nothing in their life experience has shown that to be true for most of these kids. In fact, it's been the opposite. So that was lesson number 1, no hope. Lesson number 2, really, really dysfunctional system that needs a lot of work and still probably does, right? Because the next day I got a call and said, hey, Heather, you don't have to worry about, as if I was worried, by the way. You don't have to worry about seeing such and such. By the way, we just moved him across the state. He's at Dakota Boys and Girls Ranch in Minot, North Dakota now. Awesome. Did we make any attempt to try to make sure he got the treatment that we were so damn sure he needed that we court ordered it? And then you pull him out one day after I work with the kid and the mom, and made no attempt to try to find those services on the other end, the model that we were using. So the third point quickly follows that one, and that was, well played, my friend, well played. You could not have played your little 16-year-old hand of cards any better than how you just played them. Because our system has taught you so well. Act like a tough ass, hurt people first, because there's no sense in investing in adults and relationships and helpers, because the minute you do, it always gets taken away. Totally adaptive. So this is the other take home point. Everything that they're doing, their behavior always serves a purpose. It is adaptive. It is brilliant. It is survival. It has helped them get from one day to the next. And it's not working anymore. So our job is to take the behavior that helped them get from one day to the next and replace it with behaviors that are more adaptive and helpful. So that kid, not this one, but a different one I worked with, the 16-year-old that goes out and smokes weed every day at lunch, like what in the heck might happen to that kid if there's a system that sits with him and says, I get it. Makes sense to me why you do that. Instead, we have a system that usually our first response is, bad kid, bad choices. You're going to end up just like your parents. You better get on the right path. What if we actually honored the fact that they are incredibly resilient and adapt these behaviors so they can survive? Because maybe smoking weed is the only way he gets himself to show up for school. And again, I'm not trying to say that this explains every kid's behavior, but what if we actually just honored how functional the behavior is in helping them cope, even if it's a pain in our rears to deal with, and in fact is causing them harm? Because we honor it first, and then we help them see how it's getting in their way, how it's tripping them up, how it's not helping them get what they want, and that we slowly repack their skill set to do it differently, but honor where it comes from first. Like the kid who figures out really well how to steal crap because he's never had anything, or he has to get food for his family or his siblings. That's survival. It's brilliant. The kid that numbs out, that never engages with adults, like I just described, super smart. It just doesn't work very well when you put them in a normal setting where those factors aren't present. So you have a kid, we have kids that show up to your houses with a backpack that you can't see, that's packed full of things like, I'm ugly. You guys hear them. By the way, these are filled by foster parent statements that their kids say to them. I'm stupid. I can't do anything. No one loves me. You're going to hurt me. It's only a matter of time before you kick me out of here. Blah, blah, blah. The world's a scary place. Growing up's lies. School's stupid. Right? So when you're the kindergarten teacher, do you want to teach to that backpack or this backpack? This is what we hope every kid shows up to kindergarten with. Like, I'm a rock star. I'm beautiful. Like, I own this place, right? Like, that's a healthy place to be. That's a really solid foundation to begin. So how do we take kids with a backpack that you're going to learn about as you have them in your home? How do you slowly start to get rid of those things that are packed in there and repack it with things that help them feel safe, capable, lovable, like somebody believes in them, like they're worth something underneath all of that? Start to replace it with experiences that make them carry with beliefs about themselves, about you, and about the world around them that are positive in ways that they've never had before. And the cool thing about foster care, even though I think it's hard to sometimes understand, is you get the privilege of having this impact, whether you do respite for 8 hours or 12 hours or 24 hours, or you have a kid in your home for 3 years. You have an opportunity, because many of the kids I worked with, in fact, I can think of one off the top of my head, his life-changing statement didn't come from anyone that had a permanent relationship with him. It was the law enforcement officer that pulled him out from underneath a bed when he called 911 because his parents were beating each other. And all it took was the officer's grace and kindness and compassion and safety, and him looking square at that boy and saying, "You are the bravest 6-year-old I've ever met." That kid held on to that moment through our entire trauma treatment. Instead of the belief that he screwed up his whole family, he's the reason he's never seen his parents again, he's the reason his dad's in jail, all of those kinds of things. It took one interaction. So I always just try to help people understand these are just moments in time. It doesn't take 2 years of a kid living in your home sometimes. And the unfortunate part, right, is whether it's me doing therapy or you doing foster care, we don't always have the joy of kids coming back and being like, "You saved my life. You made all the difference." Sometimes it happens, and we glom onto those and we pack them in our dresser drawer for those tough days and remember that. But unfortunately, we don't get to see them a lot, or hear them a lot, is maybe what I should say. At the foundation of all of this is relationships. And you can do all of the strategies and the parenting techniques you want in the world, but if at the end you just don't build relationships with kids, it's going to be really hard to make change. I want to just talk briefly, and then I know I want to open it for questions here, about the importance of you also advocating that it's not just our mental health clinicians, our CPS workers, or our foster parents that need to be trauma informed. This is our world. If any of you are employers and supervisors, or you have coworkers, if you deal with humans, you deal with childhood trauma, because all adults were children once. And I guarantee you, you have coworkers and family members, right, that have histories of trauma. So this isn't just about your work in foster care. This is about your work at work and with anybody you interact with, is approaching every single human being that you cross paths with as if this might be their story. Everyone, just like when you go get your blood drawn, every phlebotomist, I hope, puts on rubber gloves to draw your blood. Not because they look at some of you and are like, "Ooh, this looks like a shady character. I wonder if there's HIV or Hep C here. I better get the gloves on." And then the next person walks in and they're like, "Oh, she looks like a sweet old lady that's, so innocent. We don't need gloves." No, every single time the gloves go on. And that's my call to action for all of you. every single time you put the lenses on, and whether you're looking at the children in your homes, and the piece that I don't get a chance to really talk about tonight, or their parents, you put on the lenses. Because oftentimes the parents are the children that we're talking about in big bodies that never necessarily had intervention that targeted their trauma, because it's not something that we talked about 20 years ago. So you put on those lenses just like the phlebotomist puts on the gloves. It's a universal approach. It really isn't about targeting who has trauma and who doesn't. Quite frankly, it doesn't matter. Trauma strategies help every human succeed. I want to skip to those. So what are some strategies? Like, these are just some take-home points. And by the way, I can send the slides to people. But like, nonverbal communication is huge, right? Just kids are so wired to look for danger in your face or to look for a threat in your face. So you know when you're angry at them, your facial expressions can be the sole thing that make the whole situation escalate into a total nightmare. Because your scowl on your face to them means the next thing that's going to happen is they're going to get beaten. That's what their experience has been. It's what we've wired. And so again, thinking about nonverbal communication and what that means to children. By the way, these are really vague. These aren't foster care specific. I would tell anybody these. Refrain from judgment. This is a good one to think about bio families. Don't let the old stuff follow them. I know it's hard, but we know that investing in families and getting families the support they need to successfully raise their children safely is the best thing that can happen to these kids. Share control by offering choices, okay? Not a novel strategy. Anywhere you can offer choice to kids in your home, the better. More choice equals them feeling like they have more control. Some people will say, lady, you're crazy. The last thing these kids need is more control. I'll tell you what, if you want to start with that approach on day one, you're going to have a battle in front of you every day you work with them. Because for many of these kids, they've never had any sense of control. And so you don't feel safe when you don't have control. And the big people, those of you sitting here, would be the first to admit it. There's a reason why some of you like to always drive the car. It's because you want to have control. You feel safe as a human when you have control. Offering choice helps people feel like they have control. Okay? The more you can do that with kids, the better. See, because when you spend your entire life, again, scared, our job, our primary goal always has to be helping kids feel safe. Every single thing you do has to help kids feel safe. Why? Because the science that we just talked about, we have to decrease the amount of times that fight, flight, or freeze is triggered on and off all the time. It's already hypersensitive and it's already oversensitive and easily triggered. So how do we sit with kids and say, what would help you feel safe here? By the way, that's a great question. And then we meet them where they're at. And sometimes we don't like what they say. Like, I want the light on and the TV on all night. I'll tell you what, you got it, kid. We're going to start there. And then we're going to figure out how we gradually help you feel safe enough that you don't need the TV that you grew up playing all night long to diffuse the party sounds in the background. We're going to help you not need that anymore because it really doesn't contribute to healthy sleep hygiene. Okay, so it's meeting them where they're at. Let them know what's going to happen next. This is about predictability. This is why surgeons, when you're going for surgery, tell you exactly what's going to happen. It helps decrease your anxiety. Respect physical space, be an emotional container. We know physical space, right, is related to kids, especially kids who've had physical abuse and sexual abuse. It can be a really sensitive area, which is also related to hygiene. Help them feel connected to all the things they've left behind, their culture, their community, their family members. A lot of times they're not even placed with their siblings. How do you make sure to honor those connections? When people, i.e. children, when children feel connected, we feel safe. When you as an adult feel connected to all the things you love, your family, your faith, your job, whatever, if we're lucky enough, right, to have our job on that list. But Connection helps us feel safe. Imagine all the connections that have been disrupted for these children. Help honor those connections. Focus on their strengths. Be honest and transparent when you can. These are things I just summarized here, but we talked about. Remember that the challenging behavior is often an adaptive response to their life experience, and our job is to help build new skills. What's happened to you versus what's wrong with you, and linking families to trauma-informed services and supports when it's necessary. Recognize and understand, and this could be a whole nother session with all of you guys, the impact of repeated trauma exposure on you and your colleagues, or you and other foster parents. A trauma-informed system has to honor the impact that working with traumatized youth has on the people caring for them. That whole piece of self-care, secondary trauma, if you haven't had training on that, is critically important, and it's a real thing. And I mean, I'd be happy if we had the time to tell you about all my own experiences where working with traumatized kids really began to impact and impair my ability to parent my own kids. And I needed to get help. So it's normal. And the most important thing about that is that you recognize when it's happening either in yourself or you call it out in your partner. Because I'll tell you what, when I was doing the most trauma treatment with sexually abused kids, I think if I could have locked my children in kennels, and never let them out of the house, I probably would have done so, because you start to think the world is just evil. And I felt like there were sexual abuse perpetrators in every corner I looked, in a way that was really dysfunctional. And that's extreme. It wasn't that bad, but my husband would probably tell you a very interesting story about that. So again, recognize that the impact of caring for these children can have on you as a foster parent, or just a human in general. Okay, I promise I'm going to stop. I'll take any questions you have for as long as you have them. I know that you tend to wrap up early. I'm here for as long as you want me to be.
I have another question. I'm wondering, as you were talking through just all of this, what place does occupational therapy come in to helping these kids and rewiring and changing behaviors, or where do you see that coming into play here?
Certainly a supportive part. I mean, many of our kids in care are getting those OT, services. Again, I think that's another place that you can ask similar questions about trauma training, because I think OT providers have to be just as aware of trauma and how it impacts kids in order for them to be successful in serving those kids. So I definitely see it as a complement, probably not something every kid needs, but certainly important for others, for what it's worth. And I'm not an OT person, so it's with no disrespect to that field. I just wouldn't know enough to say, what percentage of our kids in care need OT services and such. I know the kids that we serve in Nexus Path, and I would be willing to bet half of them have OT services.
That was going to be similar to kind of my question going off of Leslie's is, we have multiple kids, and just take one kid, for example, she has 4 different therapies a week. So it's kind of like, I'm overwhelmed with the therapies. I can't even imagine what goes through her head. And then, so is there something that we should be focusing, just, focus on the PTSD because she has been diagnosed with ADHD first, and then worry about her speech pathology, and then worry about OT? Or is it beneficial for a kid to have all of these therapies all week, every single week, and plus school on top of it she's missing,
Right. So that's a really loaded question. You can imagine I could get myself backed into a corner on a lot of those points, but here's what I'm going to say. I absolutely believe that we over-treat some kids and families. Somebody mentioned earlier too, by the way, like the kid that just refuses to talk or participate in therapy. From a clinician standpoint, that's a total waste of time. Like, there's just some 16-year-olds that there's no use in forcing therapy down a kid's throat, from my perspective. Do I believe that you give it a try? Absolutely. But no, not week after week after week, just because it makes adults feel good that kids going to therapy.
No.
Oh, somebody's not on mute. But anyways, so I guess to me, that's where you kind of have to ask your team. Here's the piece you didn't address, but here's what I would tell you. If I had to bring my kid to 5 or 6 different therapy or types of services a week, we would have a dysfunctional family life. And that matters too. So while you want kids to get their treatment, if it creates such chaos and overwhelmness in your family, it's not helping. So I do think you have to look to your team of providers that are supporting that kid and sometimes prioritize what's impacting, what's most serious here. Like, do we have a kid with sexual behavior problems? Then we probably should address that first. If, how do you prioritize the treatment? Because I absolutely think you have a great point that we often overtreat. And then you get mixed messages from the providers as well. They're not all on the same page.
Right, because they don't talk either. So that's
Right.
also challenging. So then, yeah, treatment's just all kind of goofy. But her normal thing now is she thinks therapy is normal on a daily basis. And it's like, she wants to be involved in gymnastics and all of this other stuff. I'm like, maybe we should just stop a lot of the therapies and do something like gymnastics and see if that helps with attitude and ADD
Yep.
and that sort of thing. But
yep, I think there's something to that. And I think you staff it with your team and ask, like, that's a great mic drop question. Like, what if we just are doing too much? Like, what would happen if we actually just step back? Because being involved in gymnastics might be more healing than any of those things you just suggested or that you're participating in.
I love it. You're the greatest.
Yeah. Well, I create a fair bit of controversy, let's just say. What other questions do you have? I think there's something to be said about just keeping it real, right? Like, I mean, you guys are superheroes, but I mean, there's a level at which you just got to be able to do what works too. So it's like, to me, I'm always like, you're constantly assessing what battles to pick. Like, what's the biggest battle? And if you have a kid that comes in on day one and you think you're going to pick the battle of like whether or not they make their bed, I'm like, good luck. Like, if that's the biggest battle you got to pick, I am sorry. Like, so you, and I use that, I mean, if that's a big deal to you, that's really going to shake up your house, I guess, so be it. But pick what's getting in the way the most, and we're going to target that first. We can't do it all at once. This has got to be a process. And then the healing can happen more naturally. Okay, you guys have been awesome. I don't want to cut off questions, but again, appreciate your time, your attentiveness, your great questions, and most importantly, just a huge, genuine thank you for the work that you do supporting kids and families in North Dakota. This is not easy work, and I'll just leave you with this sentiment. Keep doing your work every day like somebody's life depends on it, because it does. And we are so lucky to have you. So keep up the good work. Thank you for all you do. And you guys, Amber, Leslie, let me know if I can be of help any other time in the future.
Thanks so much, Heather. I know we'd all clap if it was worth doing it virtually. We'd clap for you, but yeah, I appreciate you being here so much. I wrote down tons of great notes, and I love the questions and the challenges that you presented us with tonight. So I know I took a lot away from it, and I'm rolling it around for my 14-year-old in my house right now. So awesome information. We'd love to get our hands on that PowerPoint. We can pass it out to everyone who attended tonight. And thanks so much. And everyone have a great night.